The mail-order bride reaches town. As plague hits, forced to hide in the doctor's private chambers, the stagecoach wheels churned up clouds of dust as they rolled into Copper Creek, Arizona territory on what should have been the happiest day of Margaret Sullivan's life. Instead, she pressed her handkerchief to her nose, trying to block out the acrid smell of smoke that hung heavy in the desert air. Through the small window, she could see buildings with yellow quarantine flags fluttering in the hot wind, like warnings from a fevered dream. "This is as far as we go, miss," the driver called down, his voice muffled by the bandana he'd tied across his face. "Town's under quarantine. Scarlet fever's got 'em spooked." Margaret's heart sank as she gathered her few belongings. A worn carpet bag containing her mother's Bible, 2 spare dresses, and the carefully preserved letters from Thomas Whitmore, the man who'd sent for her from Boston to be his bride. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles to start a new life, leaving behind the suffocating propriety of her aunt's house and the painful memories of her parents' deaths. The coach door swung open, and Margaret stepped down onto the dusty main street, her dark blue traveling dress already wilting in the oppressive heat. Copper Creek looked nothing like Thomas's letters had described. Instead of a thriving mining town full of hope and opportunity, she found herself in what appeared to be a ghost town. Most of the storefronts were shuttered, and the few people she could see hurried along with their faces covered, avoiding eye contact. "Thomas Whitmore?" she called out to a passing woman. "Do you know where I might find Thomas Whitmore?" The woman stopped, her eyes wide with something that looked like pity. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thomas passed 2 weeks ago. The fever took him quick along with half the miners. You his intended?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She swayed on her feet, the carpet bag slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. The woman caught her arm, steadying her. "I'm sorry, truly I am. But you can't stay here. The whole town's quarantined. No one in, no one out, by order of the territorial governor." "But I have nowhere else to go," Margaret whispered, the full weight of her situation crashing down on her. Her return ticket money had been spent on necessities during the long journey west. Her aunt had made it clear she was no longer welcome in Boston, and now Thomas, her only hope for a new beginning, was dead. "Margaret Sullivan." The voice was deep, authoritative, and carried a slight accent she couldn't quite place. Margaret turned to see a tall man approaching, his dark hair disheveled and his white shirt sleeves rolled up despite the dust and heat. He carried a black medical bag, and she noticed his hands were stained with what looked like ink, but was probably iodine. "Are you Margaret Sullivan?" he repeated, stopping a few feet away. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and intense, and they studied her with what seemed like professional concern. "Yes, I am. And you are?" "Dr. James McKenna. I was Thomas's friend." His expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Sullivan, but I'm afraid I have to ask you to leave town immediately. We're dealing with a serious outbreak." "And she can't leave, Doc," the woman interrupted. "Driver says the stage won't take passengers back. Military's turned them around at every checkpoint." Dr. McKenna's jaw tightened. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, then caught himself. "Forgive my language, Miss Sullivan. This complicates matters considerably." A commotion at the far end of the street caught their attention. Margaret could see men on horseback approaching, and even at this distance she could make out the glint of military uniforms and the authoritative way they rode. "Soldiers," Dr. McKenna said grimly. "They're here to enforce the quarantine, if they find you here." He ran a hand through his dark hair, clearly thinking rapidly. "Miss Sullivan, I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to trust me, and quickly." "Trust you to do what?" "To hide you until we can figure out how to get you safely out of town." His gray eyes met hers directly. "The military is under orders to detain anyone who might have been exposed to the fever. That would include you now, simply by being here. They'll put you in the quarantine camp outside town. Frankly, conditions there are." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. They're not suitable for a lady. The sound of hoofbeats was getting closer. Margaret could hear the jangle of spurs and the creak of leather. Whatever she was going to decide, she needed to decide it now. What exactly are you proposing, Dr. McKenna? My clinic has private quarters in the back. You could stay there temporarily until we find a solution. I give you my word as a gentleman that you would be perfectly safe. Margaret looked into his eyes, trying to read the man behind them. She had little choice, but something about Dr. McKenna inspired confidence despite the irregular circumstances. There was a steadiness to him, a calm competence that reminded her of her father, who had also been a doctor. Very well, she said, bending to retrieve her carpet bag. I accept your offer. Dr. McKenna nodded curtly and took her bag. This way, quickly. He led her down a side street to a modest building with a painted sign reading J. McKenna, M.D. The front windows were shuttered, but he produced a key and quickly ushered her inside. The clinic was small but meticulously clean, with medical instruments arranged on white draped tables and shelves lined with bottles and jars. The smell of carbolic acid and something Margaret couldn't identify hung in the air. Through here, Dr. McKenna said, leading her past an examination table to a door at the back of the room. Beyond it lay a small but comfortable living space, a sitting area with 2 chairs and a small table, a kitchenette, and a doorway that presumably led to a bedroom. This is where I live when I'm not making rounds, he explained, setting her bag down by the door. You can have the bedroom, I'll sleep on the couch. Dr. McKenna, I couldn't possibly… James, he corrected. And yes, you can and you will. The alternative is the military camp, and I've seen what conditions are like there. His expression darkened. It's no place for anyone, let alone a lady who's just traveled across the country. Outside, they could hear the sound of horses stopping in front of the clinic. Margaret instinctively stepped back from the window, and James motioned for her to stay quiet. Heavy footsteps approached the front door, followed by a sharp knock. Dr. McKenna, open up, sir. Official business. James straightened his shoulders and walked back through the clinic to answer the door. Margaret could hear the conversation but couldn't make out all the words. Something about checking for new arrivals, questions about quarantine procedures, and James's calm, professional responses. After what felt like an eternity, she heard the door close and the sound of horses moving away. James returned to the back room, looking relieved but tense. They're gone for now, but they'll be making regular rounds. We need to be very careful. Margaret sank into one of the chairs, the full reality of her situation finally hitting her. I don't understand any of this. What exactly is happening here? James took the other chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Scarlet fever outbreak started about 3 weeks ago. Hit the mining camps first, then spread to town. We've lost over 40 people so far, including… He paused. Including Thomas. I'm sorry, he was a good man. You knew him well? Well enough. He was excited about your arrival. Talked about it constantly, showed everyone your letters. James's expression softened. He really was looking forward to starting a life with you. Margaret felt tears threatening and blinked them back. She couldn't afford to break down now. What happens now? How long will this quarantine last? That depends on how quickly we can get the outbreak under control. Could be weeks. Could be months. James stood and moved to look out the small window. The territorial authorities are taking no chances. No one in or out until we go 14 days without a new case. And the military camp you mentioned? James's jaw tightened. Overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. People are packed together like cattle. Ironically, it's probably making the spread worse, not better. But try explaining that to a cavalry captain who thinks all medical problems can be solved with discipline and regulation. Margaret absorbed this information, trying to think practically despite the shock of everything that had happened. Dr. McKenna, James, I need you to understand something. I have no money for a return journey, even if travel were possible. I have no family who would take me in. When I came here, it was because I truly had no other options. I understand, and I want to help, but I need to be honest about the challenges we're facing. He returned to his chair, and Margaret found herself studying his face more carefully. James McKenna was probably in his early 30s, with strong features and those unusual gray eyes. His hands, she noticed, were long-fingered and precise, surgeon's hands. There was something about him that suggested both gentleness and strength, though she could see the strain of dealing with the epidemic in the lines around his eyes. "Tell me about yourself," she said impulsively. "If I'm going to be hiding in your home, I think I should know something about the man who's helping me." James looked surprised by the question, then gave her a slight smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Fair enough. I'm originally from Ireland. Came to America to study medicine, ended up out here because—" He paused, seeming to consider how much to share. "Because I had some disagreements with the medical establishment back east about treatment methods. Thought the frontier might be more open to new ideas." "What kind of new ideas?" "Mostly about sanitation and disease prevention, the importance of cleanliness in medical practice, the value of fresh air and proper nutrition in healing." He gestured around the clinic. "Things that seem obvious but are considered radical in some circles." Margaret nodded, thinking of her father's similar frustrations with hidebound colleagues. "My father was a doctor too. He always said the most important tool in medicine was common sense, but it was also the rarest. A wise man. What happened to him, if you don't mind my asking?" "Typhoid 2 years ago. He caught it from a patient." Margaret's voice grew quiet. "My mother died of grief 6 months later. At least that's what I choose to believe. The alternative is that she chose to leave me." James leaned forward, his expression compassionate. "I'm sorry. That must have been very difficult." "It was. My aunt took me in, but she made it clear I was a burden. When Thomas's letters started arriving," Margaret shrugged. "It seemed like Providence, a chance for a new beginning. And now I suppose I have to find yet another new beginning." Margaret met his eyes directly. "But first, I need to survive this one. And I need to find a way to be useful while I'm here, not just a burden on your kindness. Miss Sullivan, Margaret, you're not a burden. But if you truly want to help—" James hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I could use assistance with the patients. Someone with a steady hand and a strong stomach. It's not pleasant work, especially with the fever cases, but—" "I'll do it," Margaret said immediately. "My father taught me some nursing skills, and I'm not squeamish about medical matters." James studied her face. "It's dangerous work. You'd be exposed to the disease." "I'm already exposed, aren't I? Just by being in this town." Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with determination. "Dr. McKenna, James, I didn't travel 2,000 miles to hide in a back room feeling sorry for myself. If I can help save lives, then that's what I want to do." For the first time since she'd met him, James smiled broadly. "In that case, Miss Sullivan, I think we can help each other." Over the following days, Margaret settled into a routine that would have been unthinkable back in Boston. Each morning, James would check the street for military patrols, then Margaret would join him in the clinic. She proved to have steady hands and a calm demeanor with patients, helping to tend fever cases, prepare medicines, and maintain the sterile conditions James insisted upon. The work was indeed difficult. The scarlet fever patients suffered from high fevers, distinctive rashes, and often delirium. Margaret learned to sponge burning foreheads with cool water, to hold down patients during their worst moments, and to maintain hope even when the prognosis was grim. But she also discovered something unexpected. She was good at this work, and it gave her life meaning in a way she'd never experienced before. "You're a natural healer," James told her one evening, as they cleaned instruments together after a particularly challenging day. They'd lost 2 patients, but saved 3 others who had been near death when the day began. "I think I get it from my father," Margaret replied, carefully sterilizing a scalpel. "He always said medicine was as much about caring as curing." He was right. James paused in his work, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you. About Thomas." Margaret's hands stilled. What about him? He wasn't. He wasn't the man his letters made him out to be. James set down the instrument he'd been cleaning. I don't want to speak ill of the dead, but you deserve to know the truth. What kind of truth? James was quiet for a long moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. Thomas was a decent man in many ways, but he had problems with gambling and drinking. He owed money to some dangerous people, I think. I think he was hoping marriage would settle him down, give him a reason to change. Margaret absorbed this information without surprise. You think I should know because I don't want you grieving for an illusion. The man who wrote you those letters, the life he promised, it might not have been real even if he'd lived. Margaret set down her own instrument and looked directly at James. Are you trying to make me feel better about his death? Or worse about my judgment in coming here? Neither. I'm trying to be honest with you, the way I wish someone had been honest with me about certain things in my past. There was something in his tone that made Margaret study his face more carefully. What things? James turned away, moving to hang up the clean instruments. I was engaged once back in Philadelphia to a doctor's daughter. Very respectable, very proper. I thought I loved her and I thought she understood my goals, my desire to help people regardless of their station in life. What happened? She didn't understand. When I started treating patients who couldn't pay, when I began advocating for sanitation reforms in the charity hospital, she decided I wasn't the kind of man she wanted to marry. She broke our engagement and married a colleague of mine instead, someone more concerned with social position than saving lives. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the pain she could hear beneath his matter-of-fact words. I'm sorry. That must have been very hurtful. It was, but it also taught me something important about knowing who people really are, not who we imagine them to be. He turned back to face her. I don't want you making the same mistake I did, building a future on illusions. Margaret considered this, then surprised herself by laughing softly. James, I think you're forgetting something important. What's that? I'm not building a future on illusions about Thomas anymore. Thomas is gone. Whatever future I build now will have to be based on reality, on who I really am and what I'm really capable of. James looked at her with something that might have been admiration. And who are you really, Margaret Sullivan? I'm still figuring that out, she admitted. But I know I'm stronger than I thought I was. I know I can do useful work that matters. And I know I don't need to depend on anyone else to give my life meaning. Those are valuable discoveries. Yes, they are. Margaret met his eyes directly. The question is, what do I do with them? Before James could answer, they heard shouting from the street outside. He quickly moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. Soldiers, he said grimly. And they're heading this way. Margaret felt her heart rate spike. What do we do? You get in the bedroom and stay there no matter what you hear. If they search the clinic, there's a loose floorboard under the bed. You can hide underneath if necessary. What about you? I'll handle them. I've done it before. James caught her hand as she turned to go. Margaret, if something goes wrong, if I'm arrested or something happens to me, there's money in a tin box under the loose floorboard. Enough to get you back east when the quarantine lifts. James, promise me you'll use it if you need to. Don't try to be heroic. The pounding on the door interrupted whatever Margaret might have said. She squeezed his hand once, then hurried to the bedroom, closing the door softly behind her. She could hear James opening the front door, his voice calm and professional as he greeted the soldiers. The conversation seemed to go on forever, with heavy footsteps moving through the clinic. At one point, she heard someone approaching the bedroom door, and she quickly crawled under the bed, finding the loose floorboard James had mentioned. But the footsteps moved away without the door opening. Eventually, she heard the soldiers leave, their voices fading as they continued down the street. James opened the bedroom door a few minutes later, looking relieved but shaken. They're gone. Margaret crawled out from under the bed, brushing dust from her dress. What did they want? Routine check, they said. But I think someone reported seeing a woman in town. They're being more thorough in their searches. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. How much more thorough? Thorough enough that I don't think you can stay here much longer. It's too dangerous. Then what do you suggest? James ran a hand through his hair, clearly thinking hard. There might be another option. It's risky, but it could work. What kind of option? There's a mining camp about 10 miles north of here. It's been abandoned since the fever started, but the mine owner, Jack Morrison, is a friend of mine. He's been staying there alone, waiting for the all clear to bring his workers back. You want me to go there? I want us to go there. Together. James met her eyes directly. Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said, about building a future based on reality instead of illusions. The reality is that I care about you, more than I probably should given the circumstances. The reality is that you're the strongest, most capable woman I've ever met, and the reality is that neither of us has much to go back to in our old lives. Margaret felt her breath catch. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that maybe we could build something new together, a real partnership based on who we actually are, not on letters written by strangers or expectations imposed by other people. Margaret stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. James, we barely know each other. We've been working side by side for 2 weeks under extraordinary circumstances. I've seen how you handle crisis, how you treat people in pain, how you make decisions under pressure. You've seen the same things about me. He stepped closer but didn't reach for her. I know it's unconventional, but then again, nothing about this situation has been conventional. Margaret felt something flutter in her chest. Not the desperate hope she'd felt when reading Thomas's letters, but something steadier and more real. What would this partnership look like? We could work together, set up a proper medical practice once the epidemic is over. Maybe in the mining camp, maybe somewhere else entirely. You have real skill as a healer, Margaret. We could help people, save lives, build something meaningful. And the personal aspect? James's expression grew more serious. That would be up to you. I won't lie. I'm attracted to you, and I think there could be something deeper between us given time. But I'm not asking you to marry me out of desperation or convenience. I'm asking if you'd consider exploring what we might build together, as equals and partners. Margaret walked to the small window, looking out at the dusty street where she'd first arrived in Copper Creek. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate woman with no choices, clinging to the false promises of a stranger. Now. The mining camp, she said finally. How would we get there without being seen? There's a supply wagon that makes runs to the outlying camps. The driver owes me a favor. I treated his wife when she had pneumonia. He could hide us in the wagon bed. And then we wait out the quarantine, help anyone who needs medical care, and figure out what comes next. James joined her at the window. It's not a perfect plan, but it's a chance for both of us to start fresh. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had brought her to this point. Her parents' deaths, her aunt's coldness, Thomas's deception, the epidemic that had trapped her here. All of it had seemed like disasters when they happened. But maybe they'd also been preparation for this moment, this choice. There's something you should know about me, she said finally. I'm not the kind of woman who does things halfway. If I agree to this, to partnering with you, I'll give it everything I have. I wouldn't want it any other way. Margaret turned to face him, studying his gray eyes and honest face. And you should know that I don't need rescuing. I need partnership, equality, shared purpose. If you're looking for someone to take care of, I'm not the right woman. James smiled, and Margaret realized she was beginning to love that smile. Margaret, if I wanted someone to take care of, I would have stayed in Philadelphia and married the doctor's daughter. What I want is someone strong enough to stand beside me, not behind me. In that case, Dr. McKenna, Margaret said, extending her hand formally, I accept your proposal of partnership. James took her hand, but instead of shaking it, he raised it to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was both courtly and intimate, and Margaret felt heat rush through her at the contact. Partners, then, he said softly. Partners, she agreed. The wagon ride to Morrison's camp took place before dawn 3 days later, with Margaret hidden under canvas tarps in the wagon bed, while James sat openly beside the driver. It was uncomfortable and dusty, but Margaret found herself smiling as they rolled away from Copper Creek. For the first time in years, she was moving towards something instead of running away from something. The mining camp was more primitive than the town, consisting of a handful of wooden buildings clustered around the mine entrance. Jack Morrison turned out to be a grizzled man in his 50s, who greeted James like a long-lost son and welcomed Margaret with courtly politeness that reminded her of her father's generation. "Doc saved my life last winter when I got pneumonia," he explained, as he showed them to a small cabin that would serve as both living quarters and makeshift clinic. "Been waiting for a chance to return the favor." "How long can we stay here safely?" Margaret asked. Morrison shrugged. "Long as you need to. Military don't come out here much, nothing to quarantine in an empty camp. When this fever business is over, I'll be bringing my crew back, but that's months away yet." Over the following weeks, Margaret and James fell into a routine that felt both natural and right. They treated the few remaining miners and settlers in the area, improved their makeshift clinic, and spent their evenings talking by lamplight about their plans for the future. Margaret discovered that James was not only a skilled doctor, but also well-read, thoughtful, and possessed of a dry sense of humor that emerged once he relaxed. James discovered that Margaret was not only capable and strong-willed, but also compassionate, intelligent, and surprisingly funny when she let her guard down. They also discovered a physical attraction that grew stronger each day. It started with accidental touches while working together, progressed to deliberate brushes of fingers when passing instruments, and culminated in a first kiss 3 weeks after their arrival at the camp. They'd been working late, treating a miner who'd been injured in a rockfall. After successfully setting his broken leg and getting him settled for the night, Margaret and James found themselves alone in the clinic, standing close together as they cleaned up. "Margaret," James said softly, and she looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such tenderness that it took her breath away. "Yes?" Instead of answering with words, he cupped her face gently in his hands and kissed her. It was nothing like the perfunctory kisses she'd exchanged with suitors back in Boston. This was warm and deep and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the rapid beating of his heart. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's soon, and I know the circumstances are unusual, but I needed you to know." Margaret looked up at him, seeing her own feelings reflected in his gray eyes. "I love you too," she said, surprised by how easily the words came. "And you're right, the circumstances are unusual, but maybe unusual is exactly what we both needed." James smiled and kissed her again, more briefly this time. "Does this mean you'll marry me, Margaret Sullivan? Not out of convenience or desperation, but because we choose each other." "Yes," Margaret said, feeling a joy that had nothing to do with security or escape and everything to do with finding the right person at the right moment. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 2 months later, after the quarantine had finally been lifted and normal life had begun to return to the territory. It was a small ceremony held in the mining camp, with Jack Morrison serving as witness and a traveling minister performing the service. Margaret wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in her carpet bag through all her travels. James wore his best white shirt and a tie borrowed from Morrison. The bride's bouquet was wildflowers picked from the mountainside, and the wedding feast was beans and cornbread cooked over an open fire. It was nothing like the elaborate wedding Margaret had once imagined having back in Boston, and it was absolutely perfect. "Mrs. McKenna," James said as they stood together after the ceremony, looking out over the desert landscape that had become their home. "How does it feel?" "Like the beginning of something real," Margaret replied, taking his hand. "Like everything that happened before was just preparation for this moment." James squeezed her fingers. "Any regrets?" Margaret thought about the question seriously. If she hadn't lost her parents, if her aunt had been kinder, if Thomas had been the man his letters portrayed, would she have chosen this life? Would she have found the strength she never knew she had? Would she have discovered work that gave her purpose and love that made her feel complete? None, she said finally. Not a single one. As the sun set over the Arizona mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Dr. and Mrs. James McKenna began planning their future together. They would establish a proper medical practice, help build the growing community, and face whatever challenges came their way as partners in every sense of the word. Margaret had come west as a mail-order bride seeking security and escape. Instead, she had found something far more valuable: herself, her calling, and a love built on truth instead of illusion. It was, she reflected as James's arm tightened around her waist, exactly the kind of new beginning she hadn't even known she wanted. The epidemic that had seemed like a disaster had actually been a gift, forcing her to discover strength she never knew she possessed, and bringing her together with a man who valued her for who she truly was. Sometimes, Margaret thought with a smile, the most beautiful destinations were the ones you never intended to reach.